Hi everyone, this week's dispatch video is focusing on statutory sick pay, so the rules on notification, evidence of incapacity, and the thorny issue of whether an employer in any circumstances can withhold SSP. So two main requirements on the employee in order to claim SSP: one, notification of the absence to the employer, and two, submission of evidence of incapacity as agreed with the employer. So we'll look at notification first. The statutory rules state that an employee must inform the employer of any date on which they're unfit for work within 7 calendar days of that date. So if they're absent on one particular day, they've got 7 days, which is extremely generous after that time, to advise that they were actually incapacitated due to illness or injury on that date. If they notify the employer of their absence more than 7 calendar days after that date, and there was no good cause for delay, the employer is entitled to withhold statutory sick pay, and we'll come on to that. We might have more onerous notification requirements under the contract. So typically it will say you must ring in on the first day of absence, maybe by 9 o'clock or an hour before your shift starts. That cannot be used to withhold statutory sick pay. So if that is a more onerous requirement than in the legislation, an employee fails to comply with that notification requirement, but does tell you within 7 days of the absence, we would still be obliged, assuming the employee meets the other qualifying criteria, to pay statutory sick pay. The second requirement is evidence of incapacity. So first 7 calendar days of absence, a self-certification form is required. If the employer requires it, that's a signed statement that gives dates and a brief description of the incapacity. Normally that will be doubled up with a return to work interview from most businesses, just to put a little bit of pressure on the employee and learn more about the absence. Anything above 7 calendar days, the employee can be required to submit a medical certificate, and the types of practitioner who can now provide a medical certificate has widened, so it does include some physiotherapists, other treatment providers, that sort of thing, now known as a statement of fitness for work or a fit note. For the purposes of administering SSP, the employer is not allowed to insist on a doctor's certificate for the first 7 days. Technically, if you had contractual sick pay in excess of this, you can set whatever incapacity evidence requirements you want, but it'd be unusual to require a doctor's certificate in the first 7 days, typically because that would be charged for. There's no obligation on the GP to provide one for free. HMRC advises that the medical certificate should be accepted as evidence of incapacity unless the employer has strong grounds for believing otherwise. If a doctor's note isn't provided but something else is, we can decide whether to accept that. So I've had cases in the past where an employee has submitted a note from a doctor abroad because they've had an injury there and have had to stay there. Typically, if it appears genuine, we would generally be expected to accept that. So coming back to the idea of potentially withholding sick pay, and what we said earlier was that we cannot withhold SSP simply for late receipt of medical evidence, only for late notification of sickness. So if an employee doesn't provide us with a medical certificate for 2 weeks and then it magically appears and covers that backdated period, as long as they've notified us of their absence within 7 days of that absence, we are obliged to pay SSP, unfortunately. Now again, if we have a contractual sick pay entitlement, which is more generous than SSP only, then that element of sick pay, so we have to still pay SSP, but for the balance of the sick pay up to contractual rate, we can withhold that if the employee has not met any contractual requirements, for example, in relation to notification of absence on the day, keeping in touch, even types of absence. So many policies will say you don't get company sick pay if it's self-inflicted or you're playing dangerous sports or things like that. But for SSP purposes, late provision of incapacity evidence is not grounds to withhold SSP. There is also a question about whether we can withhold SSP if we don't believe the employee is genuinely sick. And that's a really tricky area because tribunals tend to believe medical practitioners. So us making a judgment that the employee is not genuinely sick when a medical expert has given them a note to say they're incapacitated generally doesn't fly. So we would ideally need some independent medical evidence which casts some doubt on an employee's capacity for work, rather than simply saying, we've got this medical note, we don't believe it, so we're withholding SSP. Just a couple of ancillary points on this as well. If we don't decide to pay SSP for whatever reason, we must write to the employee. They're entitled to a written statement, and they can actually dispute that with HMRC. If they become ineligible, so for example they reach 28 weeks of SSP, we have to give them a form SSP1, which states why the sickness has come to an end, and the employee will then use that to claim for social security support, such as employment and support allowance. Finally, on record keeping, we used to have to keep records of dates of sickness and SSP payments for 3 years, and that was because we used to be able to claim back SSP from the government. That ceased in April 2014. We are now required to maintain some records for PAYE purposes to ensure that we can evidence we're meeting SSP obligations should HMRC required, but we don't have to go to the extent of reporting the amounts recovered under the scheme or reporting details of SSP paid. Hopefully you found that useful. If you've got any questions on SSP or sick pay or employment law generally, please do get in touch. Visit the website chadwicklawrence.co.uk or email employmenthub@chadlaw.co.uk. Thank you.